Okay, so we'll talk about just some of my thoughts on theorizing from literature reviews. And how do y'all like to do this? Do you like to do questions as we go along or questions at the end or any preferences there? I just will do it like you normally do it.
We normally have most people ask their questions at the end, as most people feel more comfortable when it's not recorded. But if people
Okay.
feel comfortable asking questions and you answering them while it's recorded, we can also do that. So then you can just raise your virtual hands, or unmute yourself if you have a question.
Okay. Yeah, no, that works. I'm trying to get this. Oops, I don't know. Sorry. I'm just trying to get yeah, there we go. We'll put this at the top. And yeah, all right. There we go. Well, maybe this needs to go then at the bottom. I'm not sure where that's best to go. So just a little background on myself. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction. And I am at the University of Virginia. I'm in the information technology and innovation group. The position title actually has business ethics in it because that's what the donor wanted in it. But so technically it's business and AI ethics that I was brought in to specialize in and been here for 2 years. Prior to here, I was at Baylor for, I think, 15 or so. No, 20, sorry, 21 actually. And then prior to that, I was got some TCSMU, a couple of years at INSEAD. Prior to that, Baylor, starting out my career for 5 years. So I've been around a little bit, still going, and still very happy to be part of the community. I love review and theory papers. So I had a class as a student at the University of Texas, is where I did my PhD, and one of the professors was George Huber. And if you haven't heard of him, I hope you'll look him up sometime. He's a management scholar, but he did quite a bit in the information technology space too. And back then, when he was at his really his career was taking off, there wasn't information systems groups yet and departments. Anyway, he was in management. He had a paper coming out in AMR on advanced communication information technologies, the influence of advanced information and communication technologies on organizational decision making. And then he had another big review paper, an AMR paper coming out on organizational learning. And anyway, I took a couple of his classes and I remember reading his papers and thinking to myself at the time, oh, that seems like a great job. You just sit in your office and read and write, and anyone can do that. And so later I learned how really hard these kind of papers are because without the data, you don't have a story. You're having to create your own story from scratch, and very, very difficult to do actually, but I do enjoy them. And I've worked on quite a few. So the first one back in 95, and this was before there were review sections of papers, but this one was on reviewing information technology and education. And it's real interesting to me now to think about this paper because the same thing, same types of thoughts are going around now, except in the AI realm and how AI will completely change education. Back then, yeah, it was the emergence of internet had just emerged and personal computing and um, email and basic technologies, but we were already thinking about how this would change education and then knowledge management. And yeah, I won't go through all of these, but yeah, just have over the years worked on a bunch of different review papers, review theory papers. And there's always a combinate when you do a theory paper, you're also doing a lot of review. Although you can do a review paper without necessarily making a theory contribution. So you can do review without theory, but it's very hard to do literature-based theorizing without reviewing literature. So that's what we'll be talking about. And I need to get back here. There's a couple different papers that give us some topology of literature reviews, and you may have seen these. I'll give you my own perspective. But if you submit a paper to JSIS they have a yearly literature review call. And typically they do ask you, at least they have for me, because I've submitted twice there. One's been published, one is currently under second round review. They ask you, what type of literature review is it? And they ask you to use this topology here from Guy and his co-authors. And the first time they asked us that was with the paper with, actually, it was this paper here with my former student Wallace Chapista. It was on ICT-enabled development literature. And we weren't familiar at the time with, oh, sorry, I had skipped a slide by accident. I'll have to come back to that. We weren't familiar at the time with this particular typology, but we took one look at it and we thought, okay, there's only one option. If we want to get this published, we're going to have to somehow say it's a theoretical review because we know it's not a meta-analysis for sure. It's not any of these were afraid that they would say, well, that's just a summarization of prior knowledge and we don't publish that. So we kind of went straight here and said, all right, we're going to have to use this language and make it fit here. And so one of the issues I have sometimes with typologies is there's always a best or there's something you need to aspire to, which then means all the other ones, if you really are doing that, you try to couch it in language that makes it look like something else just in order to get it published. But nevertheless, these papers are helpful and they do give a lot of information for you. But I tend to sometimes shy away from typologies, even though I'm going to actually present one of my own. I did just want to mention in the slide deck, it accidentally jumped twice when I hit the arrow before. These are some papers I highly recommend if you do want to see some, what I consider very strong, pretty recent, except for the one at the bottom here, literature reviews. I mean, Gregory's here is just phenomenal and it's gotten so many citations. It is so well done, though. He covers so much literature and gives really brilliant thoughts on where to go in the future. I love this one here that was in Organization Science a few years ago. Just seems like I read it yesterday, but it was actually 4 years ago. It was really, really a nice paper on surveillance and really digital surveillance, but a great review and really put together nicely. I've recommended a couple from the JAIS. Well, for a time, I was the SE of review papers at JAIS and real happy with the papers that I got to oversee getting through the process there. And in this one, I was SE of actually, I think, two of these three here. This one, very nice one. And this one had started out at MISQ and gone through a few rounds. And then it just was disagreement on the reviewer side, what they needed. Anyway, they came to me and I said, yeah, let's go for it. And I think it really turned out nicely. And happy with that one. This is a great, just a great paper here. This one on absorptive capacity in the IS literature. So I've always go back to that sometimes when I just want to see a nice MISQ style literature review, although the standards in MISQ have changed quite a bit over the years. This is another perspective of literature reviews from Franz Rowe, and he gives these 4 dimensions. What is your goal with respect to theory? What's the breadth? The systematicity of it, so what's your inclusion criteria, what's your argumentative strategy, and he uses these 4 dimensions then to come up with his typology, and that any review paper is going to have these 4 things. You're going to have some goal, either it's a theoretical or we use theory to help us understand the literature, or maybe we use theory to explain what we find in the review, but there will be some role of theory in a literature review typically. We'll either be reviewing a problem area, a stream of literature, a particular theme, or maybe a discipline. So anyway, you get the idea that there's different dimensions of literatures that you think through when you're doing a review. And I'll say this about what do people review and what makes for good reviews. I taught a literature review class for many years when I was at Baylor, and the student would have to do a literature review. And it was always the case that deciding what to review was probably the most important decision. And it was a very difficult process because sometimes someone would say, oh, I'm going to review the literature on cloud computing. And I'd say, okay, well, what's the central phenomena you're interested in? Right? Just saying cloud computing, it's like me saying I'm going to review the literature on mobile phones. Right? Well, what about the mobile phone? So what about the cloud computing? Or I'd always encourage them, you've got to look for, I guess I was prone to looking either for a phenomena we're going to review about, or looking for some construct that's been widely used in IS and how has IS treated this particular construct. Those made for good types of papers. So phenomena would be, IS security. And there's so much security literature. We know that's a huge domain, so that's a good one to review. But sometimes it's really tricky deciding what to review, and we may touch on that again later. So some common wisdom of literature reviews, this is all a bit of background, is they should be comprehensively documented. So identify the purpose, draft the protocol, train the team if you have coders, apply screen search for literature such that others can replicate it. I will say this, I have not done this in all of my papers in the past. We didn't necessarily think quite so structured about literature reviews. There are some people suggesting literature reviews should be reproducible, at least in terms of identifying literature and coding it. So if you appropriately document it, then other people, if they do the same steps you did, they would come up with the same set of literature and they would code it, moreover, the same way you coded it. There's a pretty high bar of expectations. So they should be systematic. And some people think they should be comprehensible. What if you missed this body of literature? These papers from this set of journals that you didn't consider, maybe they give you insights. Now, I'm going to, as we talk about this today, disagree with a lot of these. This is where the field has been going towards, but I'm more of a person that's done less writing about literatures and more conducting of literature reviews. And I can say a lot of this doesn't give you the kind of insight you actually need to make an interesting paper. So these are great mechanics. If your goal is just to execute like a perfectly executable strategy, but in terms of giving you the kind of insights you need for an interesting paper, I'm less convinced this is the way to get there. We'll take about that in a minute. So I say, can creative processes be reproduced? So yes. If I tell you exactly what keywords I used and what databases I used, what time period I used, you would probably then get the same set of articles that I came up with. And if I told you exactly how I screened them, that I went through the abstract, and if the abstract had this set of words and as a core construct, then it was included. If not, it was not. So yeah, you could reproduce that. But when it comes to interpreting after the reading of the papers, we would come with completely different insights, most likely. And the other thing is, does novel insights even come from systematic coding? So a lot of the literature about literature reviews is about how to conduct it, how to code it. But the big tables, and I do tables too, but I always find that the real insights aren't coming from the tables. That's what you're doing because it's just helping you organize a big body of literature, but that's not what's generating typically your insights. And then can the review of one literature stream itself, is that enough to generate new theory if our goal is new theory development? So that's a question we'll talk about here. I've moved my things along. Okay, so a couple assumptions about research, assumptions of research about IS literature reviews. And so one is we tend to think, the literature is a single stream. So we're going to review a stream of literature, but there is no stream actually until we review it. So that's the notion that we're creating the stream. So there's papers, but they're separate papers. They're not linked together. It's when we review them that they become a string. So there's actually we're not really reviewing a stream, and we use that language, but it's a little bit misleading. So we're reviewing a bunch of different papers, and we're the one that are weaving them together into a stream. And the single stream we think of can be defined by a set of keywords. And what you typically find when you get in the literature review is you start out with a few keywords, and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, I should have also included this keyword because some other people are using this word meaning something similar. And so you end up expanding your set. So there's it's not a particular set of keywords that's defining the stream. Once again, it's you're defining the stream based on the selection choices that you make. And so another thing is a lot of times we think of a literature review as reviewing this one stream of research, when in fact you might be reviewing several what's referred to as streams and bringing them together into this collective. And so we do have this assumption, or at least some people have this assumption, that a good review is reproducible. And I'm going to challenge that one. And then coding a body of literature in a systematic way is a foundation for further theorizing. So it's an assumption. I've seen this play out in some projects I worked on where there'll be really great tables, and then the idea is, okay, well, now we've done the literature review. And my thinking is the really great tables are just the beginning, and they're actually not providing the foundation for their theorizing. They're just providing the foundation for the summarizing of the literature, but not really for the theorizing we're going to get into. And one more recent seems to be that a lot of people seem to think that Gen AI will be able to do literature reviews. And I experimented around with Elicit back when it was free. I'm not going to pay for Gen AI. That's my stance right now. So I'll do when it's free, I'm going to explore it. When it's not, I'm not. My experience with it at the time wasn't really good. At most, it could do some tables. Whether it was getting the right literature or not was questionable. And I'm sure by now you can tell exactly what literature to include in the tables. And the tables, yeah, what they can do is it can pull out the research question. If you have a research question column, it can, copy paste the question there for you. If you have a column for hypotheses, but in my experience, what my belief is that as far as it can actually get is simply pure description, that it cannot do the insightful part of reading and interpreting, which is what makes or breaks a literature review for purposes of publication. So we'll talk about that as we move along here. Sorry, I accidentally hit twice. So the way I view literature reviews is a little bit different. And if you read my editorial a few years back, I mean, this is just an overview of that. But I think of it like on this 2x2, where we have an objective, and our objective can range just purely from synthesizing. That would be if you're writing a chapter for your dissertation, or if you're writing a section 2 for a paper. It may just be purely about synthesizing what's been done, and you're not trying to push it to a higher level. All the way up to the top of theorizing, just using literature, not so much to describe it or synthesize it, purely to theorize from it. And then on the bottom here, we've got the focus, which is description versus toward identifying trends and gaps. And I was thinking of it like with a camera. So you have an objective, like that's what you're taking the pictures of. Then you have a focus, and the focus, you can have it very narrow, so it's really close up, or so you don't see a lot of the background, or it can be much broader, what do you call it, lens, in which case what's real close to you will look small, and you'll see much more detail from far away. So that would be the focus side. So thinking of a literature review kind of is like taking a picture of this literature, where you have decisions to make on how detailed you're going to get. So like with a more narrow focus, you'll be in here, and the description with a broader focus, then the literature is it's part of it. It's like, but it's not what you're most focused on is how are we going to theorize from that, and what's a theory? So that would be more in the background if we're using the camera metaphor. And thinking of this 2x2, more systematic review, more systematic processes fall down toward here, whereas more creative processes are involved when you get to the theorizing part. And the same here, identifying trends and gaps, that's I use the word systematic here. I could use the word mechanical. That's something, for example, AI could do. It could identify trends and gaps. But I think on the creative side is where it'll be less competent, most likely. Broader description is more broad. Here is much narrower, refined, looking specifically for gaps or trends. So, sorry, every time I press something, then that's what happens. So I'd say that in terms of AI, I mean, it's going to be down here. This is my perspective. And as we move up in here and get to more insightful creative processes, it's going to be less helpful, but that's my opinion. All right, so this is something I put together, try to think myself when I was looking at different papers that were literature reviews. And there's a wide range of topics, there's a wide range of styles. And so sometimes what you see is a systematic synthesis of the literature on topic X. So in the topic, in IS for us is normally some particular system or some particular IS-based phenomena. So we're going to do a systematic synthesis of the literature on this IS-based phenomena. So that's one style of literature review. Another, or what's one type of approach, what we're going to be the focus of our literature. Another is when we do an examination of how field A scholars, so in this case A will be IS, have treated or applied the theory concept of X in their research. In this case, X is often from the outside. So this would be a case like, how has the IS literature applied the concept of absorptive capacity or of culture? So one of the papers I have is on culture. One I've been working on with some co-authors, I'm not sure if we'll ever finish, was on emotion. So, culture, motion, absorptive capacity. There was a great one years ago on, it was Piccoli. Oh, it was Piccoli's paper. It was one of these as well. So where you had a concept from the outside and you applied it to the IS literature, and you just took all the IS papers that covered this topic, covered this concept from outside IS and how it's been applied. And those work pretty well. And one advantage of this type of literature review is you get a real defined body of papers to look at, because you're only looking at papers that were produced in the IS literature. And see, with this first topic here, IS topics can be covered by many different disciplines. So if we were to look at, take virtual teams. So if we research virtual teams, and there's a couple of review papers on this years and years ago, there's no reason to limit it to the IS literature, because there was a lot of management literature on IS. So then what becomes your boundaries of your review, right? So this one here, you have a more clear boundary. So that sometimes can help get things started. Another approach would be an X-based perspective, where X is typically coming from outside the discipline of the A field's literature on Z. So this is slightly different than the second. So this one here is saying, so let's take a coordination theory perspective of the IS research on virtual teams. So now we're taking a theory. It could be from the outside. Typically it is, but it could also be, because we don't have as many theories, but it could also be an IS theory. But we're taking a particular theory and then we're using that to interpret the literature on a particular topic. Now, again, here we have a case where, so this is using theory as a tool to help us analyze a large body of research. And what's nice about this is that you can take a set of literature and you can analyze it in so many different ways. So just think about the virtual team literature. I mean, you can analyze it from a knowledge management perspective, from a conflict perspective, from communication perspective. So by taking a particular perspective, then you're narrowing your focus and giving you something, I think, that makes it much less overwhelming to try. So a review of virtual teams would be enormous, would be so broad, then it would be hard to say, okay, besides summarizing it and describing it, what else can I do with it? Well, here we're going to give us a theoretical perspective of this literature. And then this last one here is an X-based perspective. X, again, comes from inside or outside the discipline of phenomena XYZ, and XYZ can be within the discipline or outside it. So an example, this would be a knowledge management perspective of crisis management. So in this case, here's a perspective. Well, this is it could be a theory too, but a knowledge management perspective of this other phenomena. Or so the care theory that I worked on a couple years ago with Ulrich Gerta would be a dignity-based perspective of the personal data digitalization phenomena. So 3 and 4 are similar. I guess 3 is from the perspective, it's an actual theory, and that theory is then being applied to this literature base. 4 is, it's not necessarily a theory, it's a perspective, like a resource-based the resource-based view of the firm perspective of whatever, some phenomena. That would be also an example of this type 4. So this is another way I look at literature reviews, is going from mostly descriptive on at the first point one to more theorizing. So I think it helps if you're starting off on a literature review to think about, what are you doing? Am I just interested in topic X and everything that's been written in the literature on topic X? Or am I interested in some theory or concept and how specifically IS literature has dealt with that? In which case, then I have to justify why does it matter specifically how the IS literature has dealt with this as opposed to other literatures? Or am I interested in taking a theory and applying it to a huge base of research to help give one perspective of this research literature, or am I interested more in some perspective out there and using that perspective to interpret a phenomena. And this one here, I would say number 4 is one you can do with more newer topics. So typically we think of literature reviews as needing to review something that's been around quite a while, right? And so like for number 3 here, virtual teams had been around so long by the time people were starting to review it that yeah, this would make sense. Here with newer topics, so let's say if we had some new phenomenon like AI-based, well, human AI relationships, right? So that's very new. And I don't think we can do a literature review on that because there's not enough literature on it yet. But we could give a perspective where the perspective is coming from literature. So this could be a anthropological perspective of human agent relationships or some other perspective. And that you could do. And then you would be much more likely to produce a theorizing from your work than you would a traditional type of literature review. So anyway, I hope some of this is making sense, but I'm just giving you my perspective, and I'm not saying my perspective is even right. It's just this is my perspective after reading a lot of literature reviews and working on a lot and trying to help students develop their own literature reviews and realizing some of the struggles with figuring out what are we actually reviewing and how do we put boundaries around that and what literature do we actually look for and things like that. And this is kind of my current thinking on if I were to give it typology, and this isn't a great typology really because there's no diagram with it, there's no dimensions, so they're all quite different, but this is what I'm seeing. I think just about every literature review I see, I can put in one of these 4 categories by now. Okay, so move on. So talking about the role of theory and literature reviews, and if your goal is to create a new theory, then the role of the theory is, that the role of theory is creating theory. So you don't have the theory is not helping you with your review. You're actually using your review to develop theory. Other cases, theory is a priori organizing framework helping you organize your literature. Other cases, the result of your work is an emergent organizing framework. So you're not using pre-existing theory to organize your literature. You're coming up with an organizing framework, in which case, some people would call that theory, some people wouldn't. I tend to think of that also as theory, even if it doesn't have propositions and so forth. But that gets debated in the field, whether that would be theory or not. And up here, and I have in this box from my former typology, which I realize at this point may be confusing because I've jumped back to it. But sometimes we do what I would call a gap filling theory. So we do this complete literature review, we find a gap, and then we fill that gap with a theory that we create. So that's very different than a larger phenomenon theory that's much broader and covers a much bigger scope. But I don't want to spend too much more time on that. And papers move around a lot. So I've had papers that started out in one category and then they ended up in a completely different one by the time it was done. So whenever you start a review, it may not end up where you think it will, just based on reviewer comments and things like that. One thing I noticed with the knowledge management review that Miriam and I worked on together back, that was a couple decades ago, that paper, it started out as a traditional well, I wouldn't even say traditional literature review because at the time there was no tradition of literature reviews, but a big description of literature on knowledge management. And she had done that. And then I had done a theory. I had the second half of the paper was an original theory with propositions, and I had written that part. And the reviewers were mixed. So half of them, I say half, there was 5 reviewers plus an AE plus an SC. So there was a lot of feedback, 7 people in total. But 3 of the reviewers said they would prefer questions. And 2 of the reviewers liked the propositions. So we were kind of stuck. What do we do? And we decided, well, we'll just go with the majority in this case. And so I took out all my propositions, which are actually, when I went back to them years later, I thought, man, they really weren't bad. They were pretty good. And had to change everything to questions. After that, I noticed, because then I started reviewing a lot of review papers, and people would imitate the published version of the paper. What they didn't realize was that we had actually developed theory in the original version, which I think is the only reason we were allowed to then do questions as the major contribution of the paper. So sometimes it's risky to emulate the structure of a published paper because you don't know what it's been through. Because I'm convinced if that first round we had not had that whole new theory, I don't think we would have been given an opportunity for major revision. I think it would have just been rejected because it wasn't making the theory contribution. But once you start out with that, then the reviewers see it, and then they can be the ones to decide, well, we don't need a brand new theory here. Let's just give some research directions, kind of thing. When I look at our journals, I tend to see MISQ is really moved up where it's mostly expecting you to theorize. At least that's my experience, that just writing a strong literature review and maybe having a few propositions or something, which was fine at GIS. At MISQ, I don't even feel like anymore you see the real strong literature reviews. They're just trying to go right to the theorizing, and it's hard to do thorough theorizing and thorough literature review. So it's really hard to do both. JSs, I like their literature reviews. I find them to be um, very complete. I think they cover a lot of literature, and they do tend to be more focused on providing the groundwork for future research as opposed to coming up with some strong, new, broad theory, which is what, of course, you get in AMR. And with AMR, you don't really get much sense at all of the literature, right? So they read a ton, and there's a ton of references, but you don't get a sense of how the literature is all working together and really the stream of literature, right? You get the theory, but not necessarily the feeling of the stream of literature like you tend to get in JAIS and JACE's literature reviews. Okay, so let's see. In the interest, oh yeah, we do have enough time here. But when I think of what makes a good review paper, and the reason I had done this editorial at the time I did it is because I felt like people were evaluating all literature reviews with the same type of thinking, but you need to be looking for different things depending on what the goal of the literature review is. So if your goal is to develop a new theory, so to use the literature to theorize, then yeah, you need to be very articulate and really imaginative and insightful, and you need to integrate a lot of literature. You don't necessarily need to describe a lot of literature, but you need to integrate a lot of literature in it. On the other hand, if your goal is to fill some gap in the literature where you're going to have a much more narrow theory in this case. So it's not going to be broad. You still need to be articulate, imaginative, insightful, but you're not going to be integrating a whole lot of literature into the theory anymore because now it's going to be just very focused on filling this one area that people somehow have managed not to notice before in that particular literature stream. For synthesizing, you need to be interested in how you write it up. You need to be informative. If you're looking to identify trends and gaps, then in that case, you really do need to be comprehensive and convincing because you can't, I claim to have identified gaps or even trends if you haven't been real comprehensive in your search. But I would argue myself that if your goal is synthesizing and theorizing, you don't need to be comprehensive because I don't believe that the comprehensiveness actually adds to your own insightfulness, right? So there's so much that's been written. You don't necessarily need to be exposed to all of it unless you want to be making claims about, as I said, gaps or trends, right? And so I think we have to apply little different criteria depending on what people are trying to do. And this is a comment oh, from Lapine that I find helpful. If the review merely identifies a question that cannot be resolved with a well-designed empirical study, then the theoretical contribution probably does not meet the bar. But reviews that synthesize theory and produce integrative theories may be worthwhile in helping readers develop broad understanding. The integration should provide more than just a framework or heuristic. It should reflect an elaborating system of relationships among specific contexts that's theoretically grounded, internally consistent. So that would be applying if, in fact, you're up here trying to theorize from literature as opposed to more trying to synthesize the literature or identify trends and gaps. I'm going to skip some of these. There's a lot of perspectives on theorizing itself. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all these because there's too many. And I think it's nice that we're starting to see some editorials come out about, how to theorize. My perspective is that any of these should just be used as guidance or as thought-inducing mechanisms to help you think about how you might want to do it. Should not be used as templates, and they definitely should not be used as evaluation criteria to determine if someone else has done a good job. It really should be something that the person themselves who wants to do a literature review, wants to theorize from it, kind of looks for some inspiration and for some insight. But I do think that every project will have some nuances and be different in some ways. So you can't just try to do exactly the same way other people did. And now when I'm starting to get some papers that I am asked to review for journals, and they're about theory and theorizing, and they're submitted as research articles. And I always tell the SE that I am super hesitant to recommend an article that's about theorizing unless it's an editorial, because an editorial is an opinion, which is what most of these are. Once it becomes an article and it's published in one of our top journals, then it takes on a certain status or stature as guidelines that reviewers can then go to and just tick the box. Did the authors do this? Did the authors do this? Did they do this? And if they didn't, then it's not good. And so I'm real hesitant always to recommend those. I always want to suggest they be turned into editorials instead, because then it's a clear statement. This is an opinion. This is one approach, but it's not the approach, and not everyone needs to do this. Anyway, so let's go into, well, I do like this one from Shepard and Sutcliffe. It was about inductive top-down theorizing. And I won't go into detail explaining this because I'll just talk about how Olgerta and I did our own theorizing. But if you look at our CARE paper, we were asked to describe our theorizing process. Well, we didn't have that in the first version of the paper. And so I thought, wow, I know what we did. I definitely know all the stuff that I read and how I took notes and how I thought. I know all that, but I didn't have a language really to explain it that sounded very academic. And I remember reading Shepard and Sutcliffe for my classes, and always when we would read it for class, I would think, oh my gosh, this does not make any sense to me at all. Abductive top down, I'm just not understanding. And it wasn't until after doing this one particular project where I was forced then to recount how the theorizing occurred, that it occurred to me that this paper was a very good explanation of what we actually did. So we started out with literature on dignity, literature on personal data, digitalization. This was a literature review, very traditional, where we had a spreadsheet coding and everything. Dignity was a bunch of books that I found in philosophy, religion, biology, and law. So we had this literature, and then that focused our attention. And then I had voluptuous notes. I mean, lots and lots, voluminous, sorry, voluptuous, voluminous notes. I handwritten a lot of these handwritten notes, lots and lots and lots of notes. That was sensory representation and figures and power, and then conceptual representations, coming up with names and constructs and things like that. And then this initial theory, but then we'd always have some iterations back. Wait a minute, now we need to read justice literature. So come back, read more literature. And then once again, take notes, once again, try to conceptualize it, once again, try to theorize it from it, and then, oh no, now we need to read literature on, something else and go back. So it actually became a pretty good, I thought, way to explain actually what we had done. So we relied on that language. But there are some others that are very good. So this one from Fisher's getting a lot of attention. I see a lot of papers come in and claim to use phenomena-based theorizing and then reference Fisher, and I am very glad Fisher is an editorial. And when I see them do that, I struggle a little bit with this because I loved this editorial, and I immediately wrote him and told him how much I loved the editorial, and I shared the one that I'd written with Olgerta. And the thing that's a little bit different here is that I'll agree with all this. You have personal experience, you have observations, you have data, which is your literature, you have conversations with co-authors, with colleagues, you look for examples out in the real world. Now, he's doing all this to pull it together to recognize a phenomena. And in my work, it always starts with a phenomena. So we're not trying to use the literature to identify the phenomena. We use the phenomena to identify what literature we look at. So the phenomena in my world starts up here. Then we get all of this stuff to try to understand the phenomena. And so it's a little backwards to me, but I do love the editorial, but there's not a lot of detail here. So when people say, well, they did phenomena-based theorizing, I'm like, well, what does that mean, right? So exactly what then did you do? When did you decide what the phenomena was? And then because the theorizing is here. I mean, the theorizing is what happens to get us to this box here. And if all of this is getting us just to recognize the phenomena, then, how do we get down to here to the actual new theory? So this one's a little tricky one for me. This I love. This is Robert Gregory's and Ola Hefrinson's. I'd asked them to do an editorial for JAIS, and they did one on, they called it phenomena-driven theory. And in their work for AMR, they themselves described their theorizing as phenomena-based theorizing. And that was sufficient, right? But I asked him to go into more detail about like what they did and how it came together. And I love their model here. So they have, different things but I would highly recommend this if you're interested in the topic of literature-based theorizing, but I won't try to summarize theirs for you just in the interest of time. And then Amber Young and her colleagues, Anne and Jerry Kane, also wrote an editorial for JIS about how they theorize for their MISQ and there's a theorizing the future. And this is really a great, I think, something that's really great for IS researchers to do is let's try to not theorize what's been, but what's coming. And that's a very different thing. And so they walk through their process that they used at MISQ and talked about, their theorizing process and give advice for authors there. So then this last one here before just kind of talking about my own personal process is from Suzanne Rivard. And this one was published, now I'm forgetting, I think it was in JASIS, but very nice. Like you read, you think, reflect, you write, and you try to find cohesion, then you end up reading some more, reflecting, write, and try to get read some more, and kind of go through. So there's not a clear end point. You just kind of keep doing this until finally you've reached this cohesive point where you feel like your contribution now is solid. So you've gone through different phases here, but the nice thing of hers is a spiral model, and you start kind of small, and then you kind of keep having to go through this numerous times till you finally get to the point where you're like, yeah, okay, I'm done. And I think it's good in the sense it's very realistic, and I do think this is what people go through when they're trying to theorize from literature. So getting now then to what Olgerta and I did for the care paper. So after we did that paper, and it was in a special issue of MySQ with 3 other theory papers. Since I was editor-in-chief of JAIS, I'm like, oh wow, I want to get all the authors of those papers to write editorials about their theorizing process. We can publish it in JAIS, and I think that'd be a nice contribution. So I sat down and really spent a lot of time thinking, okay, so what did we do? What did we really do? I mean, we said we did Shepard and Sutcliffe, but that was after the fact. So let's get to the nitty gritty. Shepard and Sutcliffe give us this really kind of high level perspective of what we're doing. I want to give a ground level perspective of what we did. And so I came up with this kind of terminology, and we went back and forth with Olgerta to make sure it was consistent with what she was thinking too. But so one activity is just, well, first you have the theory genesis. So if you're theorizing from literature, it's not that you go into it with an idea, I am going to theorize this, right? So there's some genesis, right? Something triggers you to think, okay, this phenomena needs theorizing, and what is it? And this phase here is a real important phase, and we don't actually talk about it in the paper or the editorial, but it's something I really encourage all the folks I work with on literature-based theorizing to do. I call it the armchair theorizing phase, where you just sit back yourself before you read, well, you can read some literature, but before you try to code anything or analyze anything, you just kind of sit back and think to yourself, all right, what do I think? How do I see here's this phenomena, how do I explain it myself? And take notes and let your mind go free, even come up with some propositions if you want, because before you let your mind get populated with all sorts of papers and details, let your mind kind of go free and really think about this phenomena just based on your observation, based on your experience, based on what you know. And that kind of draws a little bit from Fisher, right? Because he had that observation, curiosity, those things. Just let your mind go free. And that's really, really important. So ours actually started out, I was preparing a presentation to give in Sweden, and they'd asked me just to talk about anything, and it was going to be open invitation to undergraduates, master's, PhD, people from the neighborhood. I mean, anyone could be there. And I thought, oh my gosh, what do I talk about? So anyway, I put together this whole presentation that it wasn't based on research or literature, just based on my thoughts and my experience. And it was about dignity and advances in information technology, and kind of went back just through my own lifetime, looking at how changes and framing this in a dignity language, and ended up just reading one book on dignity to help kind of hash that out. But that was the genesis. And then when we decided, okay, well, actually it's a really good topic, let's turn this into a paper. Well, that's when the theorizing itself started. And now, in order to make this a legitimate, paper worthy of one of our journals, one of our top journals, then all of a sudden, we have to go through a whole lot of activities here. And so we've got to inform our thoughts, which is a lot of reading and taking notes on reading, coding reading, finding examples to confirm what we're reading, and note-taking on note-taking and outline, things like that. We have to materialize our thoughts. So that means organizing our ideas into tables, into diagrams, into drawings, and refining those. We have to generate new thoughts. So that's just time thinking. Actually, that's my favorite part of projects, really. I mean, reading is nice. Note-taking is kind of mechanical, gets a little bit boring, but I'll put on music for that. Just thinking, though, I really enjoy that part. I'm just giving myself time just to think about everything I've read and wrestle with things mentally. It's like, wait a minute, this proposition is inconsistent with this one. I've got to change something. Just giving oneself time just to think and dialogue with one's co-author. Sorry for the misspelling there. And then building theory elements from thought. So extracting new constructs, but you can't get there until you've gone through all of this. And the reason we diagrammed it like this is because once you start informing your thoughts, right, then you're going to need to start materializing them. But of course, you have to be generating new thoughts too. And then you're going to have to be building theory elements. So they're kind of all working together as you go through this process. And to see how it came out a little bit like what we did. So part of when you do any type of literature-based literature review, typically you're going to have some literature search. Like in our case, the dignity stuff was all books that would have been recommended by a philosophy professor I knew. But in terms of the IS literature, we had this systematic process, right? So we looked at keywords, personal data, personal information, wearable devices. We started to think about anything that would lead us to papers where personal data was present. And so, yeah, digital self, digitized individual, just broad, many terms as we could think. I think the first round might have just been a few terms and we added more terms. And then, you have to interpret this, and this was then into some coding. And then we had categorizing literature after we coded it. But an example of the coding would be this. So I'm real big on spreadsheets. So anytime I do a literature review, even if it's for section 2 of a paper and it's only 30 papers, I always do a table and author that just so I can remember. Research question, always put that in. These here will vary depending on what the literature review is. Also, at least D and E. That's going to vary depending on the project. So this project was type of ICE and type of IS and type of personal data. Then I'll have a column for theory, column for method, column for findings. One of the most important columns is this column, and these are supposed to be my insights, not the papers. And that's a real important one because when it comes to the writing phase, what you tend to find is it's your insights that really make the paper what it is. It's not enough just to tell everybody what other people have found. You have to be able to add your insights on top of that. So that becomes a real important column. And then there may be one other. In this case, we had a column on dignity that was added at the end after we read the literature review. And there was 45 papers that we found for this. And I read all of them and wanted to make sure I really felt comfortable with the literature. And a lot of times you don't necessarily need to read every single paper if you're working with a co-author, but I felt in this case that I had a responsibility to. So I will say this, I've been on a project recently, and it's also a literature review, and my co-authors who were doing the coding, they came up with a table that's got like lots and lots of columns. Like it's going off into the PP and QQ and way. And the problem is it gets overwhelming. Like there's too much. So if you do some kind of coding in a table, my recommendation is don't go overboard. Because if you start coding too much, I mean, you think, oh, that's creating data that you can use. But the only thing that's the really, really important stuff is going to be right here. And then this is all stuff you need to know. Like you need to know this is all the stuff here is going to help you categorize and group the papers. So you need to be able to group them into kind of topics. But boy, if you start getting over there into the Z and then you're the double A's, B's, all the way to double Z's, you're going to have so much to work with. I think it's going to be overwhelming. But anyway, that's my take. So that's the straight out traditional type of literature review. And if you've got two coders then you can come up, after we did this coding, what we then were able to do is like, okay, by then we had already decided that it was going to be CARE. Actually, I decided that at the very beginning. I wanted to call it care. And so then we had to figure out what's going to be the CARE. Oh, I already knew that C would be claim, A would be affront, and then R would be response. The tricky part was the E. Like, well, I can't be car, so we have to come up with an E. But anyway, that was kind of fun thinking of how we were going to get this labeled. But then we went back through the table and we could say, all right, well, so this was about this paper. We did this independently, and then I put them together. But so saw it as about the claim or about the affront or about the equilibrium or about the response. And sorry, gosh, then we could do the see if we were in agreement, and we were in agreement over all of them at a couple. Once we did that, then there's categories. And so, for example, I could take all that were coded as C, and then I come up with what I'm seeing in this group of papers based on the table is this. Here's the technologies covered, here's the theories covered, and what I'm seeing is, and this is going to be the most important part when writing a paragraph. But so this could then end up becoming, a subsection in the paper. And we had that for each one of the 4 major categories. So you're going to categorize your literature, you're going to write about it, and your tables can be helpful there. Another thing that I think is very important, so I will emphasize this because I think if you really want to do insightful reviews and you want them better than an AI can do them, and you want them to be something that people really are going to read and get value from, it's not enough just to code papers. And the coding's kind of easy because coding, you don't have to read super detailed each paper. But if you want to really get insights that you're going to use to help you theorize, then you really do have to read the papers. You can't just go in and be looking for a research question, a theory, a method, hypotheses, and then jump over to the findings and find that that's not going to be enough. And so what I tend to do when I read, and this is slow, but this is how I do it. So I have these files and on my papers for every project I work on. And so this is called just my notes file with readings. So all these are readings, and no, so hard here. These are like readings. These were all recommended by the AE. I can tell by the name. So I had AE reading notes, but these were all that the AE recommended. And so I'll pull up one. So let's pull up the Taylor one. It's this paper here. Then I've got all these highlights. And then what I do is I copy and paste the highlights into a Word doc. And so then I just have this doc, and I have it for every single paper. So these are very, very lengthy, these note documents, because they'll just be Word docs with things that I highlighted from the papers, and they're in there. And once I've done it for all the papers, and there's a lot, so this was like just a subset of papers recommended in the review. I've got, if you look at the actual files with all the papers, like every single one's then accounted for in notes. And sometimes these notes get up to be like 100 pages worth in the doc file, but they're very useful. Then the next step is to take notes on the notes, what I call notes on notes. So I've got so here's, for example, notes from this book by Rosen. So I read this book. And so I just, different things I highlighted in the book. And then I've got notes from other books. So the Cambridge book's got notes here. I've got notes from this Cost book. And so I have this file with all these notes. So then I print those out, and then I look for categories. And so then I have the notes on the notes file will have the categories. So like meaning of dignity. So that's spoken about in this particular paper, C9. That's going to be the Cambridge notes. This one was a book that had, I think, 25 chapters. Each chapter was a separate article, right? So this is the 9th chapter of that book. Some comments there. Here's the 20. They made a comment here, all dealing with this definition of dignity, right? And then there's forms of dignity, and this one's from the Rosen book. Here's something related to forms of dignity. And so it's like interpretive coding. It's basically, or I guess this would be the stage 2 of coding. So this is the stage 1. Stage 2 is I'm looking for these categories. So these notes on note files, they become very important, because then all of a sudden, you can picture a paragraph in the paper about what does dignity even mean. Here I've got the references. I've got literature I'm going to draw from. there's ideas in here that then I, write, make it my own, reference these people, and you've got a paragraph. And maybe we're going to have forms of dignity, maybe not, right? And actually, it ended up very important in the paper because there were these different forms that we talked about quite extensively. So my recommendation, I don't know if this is the right way for everybody, but I think the real highlight here is that it's not enough just to do the tables. You really have to read papers, at least a set of papers. And this is where when you do your keyword search and you get these 500 papers, you do not need to read 500 papers. Maybe you narrow that down to 100. You don't need to read 100 papers, but you do need to read a certain amount of papers that are going to be the ones that really inspire what's going to form the material for your theorizing itself. You've got to read those. You've got to take notes on them. You got to really think about what you're reading, and you got to pull together a lot. And the only way I've found personally to pull together a lot of different thinking on topics together is to do these, do this, what is a qualitative analysis of the highlights I make in the papers, because I'm highlighting the parts that somehow stick out in my mind at the time I'm reading it as something that's interesting. Anyway, so yeah, this is still from the notes on the notes, the basis of dignity, principles of dignity. So it kind of goes on, this whole file. And so I do that for, pretty much everything that I read. And there was a whole, here's some justice notes at one point, second round revision. I thought, man, I need to read justice literature in order to build a couple propositions here. So I did a quick review of justice literature. But the great thing when you're theorizing, since the topic of the paper wasn't justice, I could just go to, in this case, Scholar Google, get the top-sided papers, do a little bit of forward backward chaining, get a sample of 10, 15 papers, read those, do my note taking, and that was more than enough then to help me build the propositions, which I thought were nice ones, but they did get cut after round two and round three. So at least I didn't spend too much time on that. We call those literature sprints, that sometimes you do literature sprints, which means you're going to say, look, I don't need the whole body of research. I just need to get enough of it that I have a good understanding of what they're talking about in this literature stream, and I can use it to help me theorize a particular mechanism that then builds my proposition. So literature sprints are quite important. And oh, I guess I had this shown in different ways here. This was the one I should have kept. This one looks the nicest, sorry. So yeah, and the other thing I showed in our framework that we developed was this, I think I called it materializing thoughts. This is writing things down. And so I do a lot of diagramming, trying to synthesize what I've read, even synthesizing my notes on notes into different kind of diagrams. And yeah, there's just a lot of paper, a lot of diagrams that go into any type of project, working with different diagrams. Loved this one, but we didn't end up getting that one into this particular paper. And we keep hoping we'll think of some other way to use it at some point. But Olgert and I had a great working relationship because I could draw something like in hand and then show her what I'm thinking about. And then she turns it into a great looking model. So it was really fun. Um, so I want to make sure I'm leaving time for questions. So I know that's been quite a bit. So there's in the close here, you're welcome to, I'll read these thoughts from theorizing from literature. But what you're going to find is that there's so many different people like trying to give you advice, telling you how hard it is. And you need to identify paradoxes, you need to identify tensions, you need to take into context. And I think personally, from having gone through this process now many times in my career, I feel like every case is different. So it depends very much on what your objective is, and if you're taking that one typology I gave you, like where are you taking concept X and applying it to literature Y? Are you taking theory and using that theory to explain what's happening here? What are you doing? And so much of how your literature review and how your theorizing plays out depends on those decisions you make. So we can't really expect them all to look the same or feel the same. What we can expect, or what you hope to achieve in any theorizing from literature, is insightfulness, and that it can't be replicated. It can't be, I don't think it can come solely from tables. It really has to come from spending a lot of time, reading, reflecting on what you've read, taking notes on that, giving yourself time to synthesize those notes into something new that makes sense, and then writing that up in a style that's interesting for other people to read. So, oh, sorry. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. Actually, I'm thinking what happened. I pulled up the wrong version of this because I didn't get to the end slide like I should have now. But what I'm going to do now is close it off now and then just give us time to discuss and answer any questions. So I'll stop the sharing. I can start it again if anyone has a particular question.